And here we are again dealing with reiteration, because reiteration is more than what it initially appears to be. I take advantage of this unit about internal habits to delve as much as possible into what underlies reiteration, its fundamental intent, since habits are closely related to the intent of reiteration, much more than you might imagine, as you will understand as you follow the video. If we really come to understand the fundamental intent of reiteration, the fight against habits becomes immensely lighter, easier, even fun, and accompanied by a lucid strategic vision. Moreover, it will really fit into the active processes of the art of stalking, inducing the connection with the active side of infinity. The intent of reiteration is cosmic in nature. It belongs to the realm of intent, understood as an active force in the universe that decides events in the sphere of awareness. In short, the intent of reiteration is one of the essential forms by which intent, the spirit, the active side of infinity, exerts its hegemony in the flows of living things. It's one of its fundamental modes of action. This is one of the reasons why no action of ours, even the smallest ordinary action, can be considered trivial or should be deprived of due attention. Whenever we do this, we become more passive and disconnected from the spirit. Therefore, comprehending the intent of reiteration also means being able to recognize it in actions, in their external and internal components. Especially internal, in terms, as we will see, of the discipline of sentiments and the energy flows related to the form of habits. The recognition and the knowledge it brings lead us to profoundly change the attitude in terms of attention and energy we apply to the affairs of daily life. At that point, there can no longer be anything trivial, anything unworthy of attention. And what we really need and what we need to get rid of will be much more obvious. And this leads us directly to the question of habits. Comprehending the intent of reiteration in actions moves us from being passive to being active subjects. The force with which habits bind us comes from the intent of reiteration, not from repeating the act itself. It is not merely a mechanical effect. It is much more than that. It is about the way time shapes, molds energy currents. Whenever we passively repeat the habit, it reinforces itself by drawing on that intent. We actually add an additional amount of that intense force, which further defines the form in which the energy currents must flow in relation to that specific action. And remember that actions are the language of intent. All of this applies much more to internal habits, which are that part of the habit that really defines the energy pathways and the operation of time in that particular cycle of attention and energy. However, if we use the intent of reiteration by consciously deflecting its effect, then it becomes much easier to dismantle habits, to get out of the preordained form and make ourselves visible to intent. Remember that the part of stalking that deals with habits has among its purposes precisely to achieve an effective relationship with the spirit. Without the intervention of intent, there is no stalking. It is the spirit that does the stalking. But to do this, to achieve this different use of the intent of reiteration, we need to have the full and clear comprehension of it. Mind you, I'm not talking about learning how to set up a reiteration sequence, like the way we have seen previously. That's relatively easy, since to a certain degree it's pure technique. But that's just the gateway, or it's also the gateway, what puts you in a position to see the building of reiteration. Beyond that limit, when we enter the building, we reach a much wider territory where technique is replaced by art, by magic. But this art needs the comprehension of the intent that sustains it. Then it becomes clear that what we call reiteration and the habits that are a direct consequence of it are not based, as it seems by looking only at the surface, on the simple mechanical repetition of something. But they sink their power, their binding capacity, on a real fundamental power, on a basic force of the universe. The ancient seers realized this. Their rituals were the active expression of the use of this cosmic force. Comprehending the intent of reiteration clarifies what underlies habits. Mastering reiteration makes it possible to break habits. There is one thing that can make what the intent of reiteration really is much clearer to you. And it is a very visible thing that we can gaze at from our inner silence. What we call instinct or innate behavior is nothing but one of the visible effects of the intent of reiteration. Acting at the level of the individual and of the species, it is a fundamental aspect of intent. Some effects are utilitarian, meaning that they relate to survival, and many others are completely unnecessary. Distinguishing them is part of getting rid of useless things. You can see it very easily in other living beings that are all subject to the intent of reiteration. Inorganic beings do not escape it either. On the basis of this, you can do your gazing aimed at the clear perception of the intent of reiteration, with a progression that can, for example, begin with gazing at the dog bringing back the stick, the cat playing with the mouse, the birds in their social trajectories, the insects intent on their indispensable activities. A later stage of this gazing may concern our fellow human beings and becomes a more focused version of the gazing at the structure of sociality, in which we gaze at our fellow human beings from this perspective. That is, from the perspective of grasping the intent of reiteration, which is binding them to social actions of a nature that is either innate in our species or acquired over time. But then you have to come to apply the same kind of gazing to your own reiterative cycles, especially the internal ones, which is already permanent gazing. To make things easier for you, you can certainly start first with material actions, thus external habits, until you can clearly distinguish when we are moved by this aspect of intent, when we are bound to that action. At that point, however, in order to grasp what we are most interested in, which is the internal form of a habit, the true energy form, you have to connect in the dual perception the internal view of the emotional cycles and the energy cycles. There are tricks we can use to highlight more the intent of reiteration and then use it to our advantage in fighting against habits. I'm suggesting 2 ways, but you can have fun trying to come up with others, always keeping in mind the principles that govern reiteration and the purpose we are pursuing, which is to understand the intent of reiteration with the goal of dismantling the grip of habits. And then, as a result, being able to intervene on the human form and the suggester, but also using our actions as a language for intent, so no longer passively, but as an active form of language. You could, for example, make a reiteration that you can incorporate into your daily life and drop it when it really becomes a habit. That is, you create a reiteration, it becomes coercive as a habit, you insert it into your daily life, and then you get rid of it. You have it under control, you can get rid of it easily. So it already becomes an example, a guide for comprehending the intent of reiteration and disengaging from true habits. Or you can make a short reiteration that you can insert into the habitual cycles of daily life in order to break them up, to interrupt, to break the forms of the habit. But remember, though, we're talking about internal habits now. Therefore, this strategy, I suggest, can also start with reiterations of external actions. But these must then connect to a real energy form that supports them. They have to become internal. That is, the reiteration that you insert must consist in one way or another of internal cycles consisting of the effects of the energy currents in terms of emotions and feelings, and in terms of the energy currents themselves. To give you a better understanding, I'll give you a very simple example, which also works as I'm telling you now, but keep in mind that it can become much more complex and consequently much more effective. I can, for example, associate a certain body movement or gesture with anger or resentment, and another movement or gesture with shame or satisfaction. So I alternate them in a reiteration cycle until I become fully master of the outer action and the inner cycle, being able to see the associated energy form as well. For it to work, obviously the feelings or emotions that we associate must be true. Using a feeling or emotion as a trigger to dismantle a habit is very effective indeed. But even more effective would be to be able to take the next step, to go deeper, to see the energy flows moved by the intent of the reiteration in the habit, and then intervene directly on those.